Hello, everyone. Let's take a look at From an Essay on Criticism by Alexander Pope. So, I'll talk first a little bit about the context of the poem. So, Alexander Pope was an English poet. Now, because he's publishing in the first half of the 1700s, we can say that he's an Augustan poet. Okay, so that period from Queen Anne, King George I, King George II of England is the Augustan period of literature. So, in your essays, try to refer to him as an Augustan poet at one point. So, he publishes this poem in 1709 when he's 21. Now, he is criticizing young people throughout the poem, so it is perhaps significant that he himself is young. The important thing to understand about this poem is that Alexander Pope was a Roman Catholic at a time when it was very difficult to be a Catholic in England. And because he was a Catholic, he wasn't able to go to university. He was denied access to university. Now, this gives him a reason to be angry at the intellectual elite of the time. It gives him a reason to want to criticize those people at universities, intellectuals, for being arrogant and having a sense of superiority. And that's exactly what he does in the poem. Okay? So let's go straight into the poem. Now, this is only an extract from a longer poem, hence why it's called From an Essay on Criticism. So I have the poem on my screen, and I'd like to talk about 5 things. So in this poem, he uses 2 metaphors to talk about knowledge, learning, but also writing and creating great art and poetry. The first metaphor that he uses is the metaphor of drinking from the Pierian spring. Now, the Pierian spring is an allusion to Greek mythology. According to Greek mythology, on Mount Olympus, this spring of water, if you were able to drink from it, you would gain knowledge, you would gain artistic inspiration. Now, he uses this allusion to think about knowledge. And he says that a little learning is a dangerous thing. And he talks about the idea of drinking only a small amount of this Pierian spring water. He says shallow draughts, in other words, a small drink from this spring will intoxicate the brain. And so what he says here is that to have some knowledge will make you drunk, intoxicated. Now, people who are drunk are overconfident, unrealistic, and frankly quite annoying. It's only when we drink more, and he says drinking largely sobers us again. It's only when we drink more that we become sober. Now, the connotations of sobriety, of being sober, are very different. People who are sober are sensible, serious, and probably hard-working. So the first extended metaphor is that of drinking from the Pierian spring. So if you can explain that extended metaphor, make sure you also explain the allusion to mythology. Now, the second metaphor, which he talks about for pretty much the rest of this extract, is the metaphor of climbing a mountain. And he talks about learning and becoming a skilled writer or poet is like climbing a mountain. And he does that in a few different ways. The first thing he does is he imagines us, or he imagines a poet at the beginning of the journey, fired at first sight with what the muse imparts. In fearless youth, we tempt the heights of arts. Now, his view of these young and confident and maybe even arrogant young men who think they're going to conquer the world is pretty negative, I would say. Okay? He describes them with this fricative alliteration: fired, fearless. Now, fricative alliteration is generally quite angry, generally a bit resentful. So those adjectives, fired, first sight, fearless, it shows his bitterness, it shows his resentment at these young men who think they own everything. And then he makes it clear that he doesn't approve of them with these words: the bounded level of our mind, short views we take. He says that those people who think they're going to conquer the world, they take short views. They don't see how far they have to go. They can only see a short distance. But then what he talks about is actually when we start to learn more and more, and we read great poets and we study science and we learn more, we realize that there is so much more to learn. And he talks about a feeling of strange surprise at how much there is to learn. And in the metaphor of climbing the mountain, he says, distant scenes of endless science rise. So that adjective distant is interesting because we can see how far we have to go, but it's a long way away. It's described as distant. Okay, so as we get a bit higher, we see how far there is to go, but it's a long way away. He talks about these young and confident poets and thinkers and says that they seem to tread the sky. In other words, they seem to think that they are on top of the world. They seem to think that they are at the absolute pinnacle. Look at the word seem, though. If something seems to be the case, it doesn't mean that it really is. Put that together with the word appear, and you've got a semantic field of illusion. Seems to be, appears to be. However, just because something seems or appears to be a certain way, that doesn't mean that it is. It seems like the eternal snows have passed. Now, I see this as a metaphor for all of that hard work and all of that suffering that we've done. Imagine these young, confident men, they do a little bit of work and they think, well, the eternal snows are behind me. The hard work is done. And now I'm ready to reap the rewards. But what happens finally is when we reach the top, or rather, when we reach the top of the first hill, the first part of the mountain, quote, we tremble to survey the growing labours of the lengthened way. We realise that we have so much further to go. We thought that was the top, but actually we get up there and we realise there are many more peaks to reach. And the verb tremble shows how intimidating this can be. So for me, we've got 5 quotes or 5 things that we want to focus on in an essay. And if we cover these ideas, we'll be in a very good position. The last thing I'll talk about is the structure. Okay, so I wouldn't have this as a whole paragraph, but rather I would try and add this on to the end of one of my paragraphs. This poem is written in heroic couplets. Now that means 2 things. The couplets part comes from the fact that there are rhyming couplets. So if you look at the last word of each line, you'll see that they are grouped together in pairs of rhyming words. Thing and spring, brain again, imparts arts. So you've got rhyming couplets, but also it's written in this iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line, with the stress on the even numbered syllables. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. Now, the significance of this is that many of Pope's contemporaries were writing using these heroic couplets in the same way that the great epic poets of the classical era did. People like Ovid and Homer, they were writing in heroic couplets, and some of his contemporaries thought they were so good that they could also write in these heroic couplets. So what he was doing was he was mocking them. He writes in this style because he's trying to mock the very people that he's writing about in the poem. So if you can get something in about how he uses heroic couplets to mock the arrogant and overconfident intellectual elite, then you'll be onto some really good historical context, but also form analysis. Okay, and that for me is just about everything you need for this poem.